Hi, welcome to Green Peak Alliance for Your Health. I'm Elizabeth Kelsey, and I'm here with Dr. Alan Budney, who's a professor at the Geisel School of Medicine in Hanover. We're here today to talk about marijuana, the science behind marijuana. Welcome, Dr. Budney.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome. I wanted to first ask, what are we supposed to call marijuana these days? I hear marijuana, cannabis used interchangeably. Is there a difference? What should it be?
Well, that's a great question. I wish I had the answer. Cannabis is the more technical term for the plant that most people are referring to when they talk about marijuana. Mm-hmm. So cannabis is used internationally pretty much by most scientists, and even in some countries is the main way they talk about it. In the United States, most people know it as marijuana. Yeah. So I think the government, the federal government, are hesitant to just change the name to cannabis because I think they're afraid the public won't know what they're referring to. Yeah. So when I give talks, I always say cannabis/marijuana. Then I usually use cannabis just because I feel like I'm a scientist and I try to stay technically correct.
Right. That makes sense. And speaking of your science and lectures, I was in a lecture of yours once in which you referred to that old film, Reefer Madness. And you had said that these days we're going through a different kind of reefer madness. Can you talk about that old film, what that was about, and what we're seeing now?
Sure. In the late 30s, there was this film made called Reefer Madness that people weren't quite sure if it was propaganda coming from somewhere, or exactly what it was. But pretty much it demonized and exaggerated the harms from marijuana. Use marijuana and you'll jump out the window, or use marijuana and you'll kill people. And it was very dramatic and had an old kind of creature feature kind of feel to it. It became really a cult flick. Mm-hmm. They've colorized it and everything now, so you can still get it and watch it if you like. What I referred to in my talk as the new kind of reefer madness is kind of the opposite. Now we've kind of come full circle, and the whole country and other countries and people elsewhere are talking about how cannabis or marijuana is good for everything. Mm-hmm. So it benefits this, it benefits that. Almost any health problem you have, people are talking about some form of cannabis being good for it. So there's all this advertisement, and there's lots of publicity, there's public news shows, etc. There's now an industry, all marijuana is good for you, and there's all these products and different ways to take it, etc. So it's kind of just gone kind of the reverse. We've exaggerated the harms perhaps a long time ago, and now I think, in my opinion, we're exaggerating the potential benefits.
Mm-hmm. And what has legalization done to that perception of harm? 11 states have now legalized, Vermont in 2018. How harmful is it? A lot of people think it's less harmful than alcohol. Is that true?
Yeah, well, I think you sort of have to back up the conversation to say, when you're saying cannabis or marijuana and you're talking about these benefits versus harms, is what are we talking about when we say that? Because there's different compounds in the plant. Mm-hmm. And there's some forms of what people are calling medical marijuana or therapeutic cannabis that don't have any of the compound in it that's addictive, which is THC. Mm-hmm. So if we're talking about, what about this product that only has CBD in it, cannabidiol, then the potential harms are very different than we say, what about the usual marijuana product that has THC in it that gets you high? Then we're talking about all the addictive possibilities. Yeah. Same goes with what its potential effects are on the brain. People haven't separated out smoking cannabis with THC versus with CBD, and what the differential effects might be on the brain. So you kind of have to define your terms better nowadays, and that's one of the things I've been trying to talk more and more about and get people to think about and ask about. When somebody says, well, is marijuana good for this? And you say, well, what do you mean by marijuana? Yeah. That's really a question we all have to ask and find out. Well, do you mean the stuff that gets you high? You mean just CBD? Do you mean some combination? And so there's still certainly the potential, and there always has been a strong potential, that if you're using the products, the marijuana that has THC, that gets you high, that most people think about when they think about marijuana or cannabis, then yes, we have the fear of addiction, problems, behavioral problems, lack of motivation, all the traditional things that can happen, perhaps psychosis if you hit too high, certain circumstances happen. Potential benefits, not many of them have any solid evidence for it, but there's all kinds of possibilities out there. And sometimes people think it has to do with CBD, some people think it's THC, so it's quite it's probably like a 10-hour show for us to go through those kind of things. So it's
Yeah.
very complicated, but I think the government, public health folks all need to start an education mission to start to differentiate what we're talking about when we talk about this product and that product, and not just label it all medical marijuana.
Right. Can you say a little more about the CBD that we're seeing in so many products all over the place?
Yeah, so CBD is cannabidiol. It's one of the compounds that's in the cannabis plant, the marijuana plant. It's, as far as we know, in most studies that have been tested, it does not get you high, so it's not part of the euphoric process. Some people think it kind of moderates the euphoric experience you have from THC, which is the active compound. But CBD by itself is what most people are talking about as potentially therapeutic for a lot of the conditions that are on the table. To be honest, it has not been well studied. Most of the claims that CBD works for this and works for that have not been even close to proven. There are not clinical trials showing that it helps with arthritis, or that it helps with stress, or that it helps with recovery. That's all conjecture. And most of it's based on some self-report. People say they've tried it for something and it's helped them. But as far as we know, there's not any clear harm from it either, certainly in the doses that people tend to be taking. It doesn't get you high, it doesn't mess with your cognitive functioning or your intellectual capacity, as far as we know. It doesn't really make you too sleepy. There aren't any really strong effects that we know that are bad. So to some degree, you could say, well, why not try it for some of these problems people are saying it works with? And to some degree, yes, you could try it, and it probably won't hurt you. Whether it helps you, and whether you're spending a lot of money on it, that's a whole nother story.
Isn't it approved in one case as an anti-seizure drug?
Yes,
Part of it?
yes. There's a drug called Epidural X, which is primarily CBD, but it's CBD that's extracted from the cannabis plant. So it isn't just pure CBD that they've synthesized. It is kind of an extract from the plant that's primarily CBD and whatever else is in the cannabis plant. And it's been FDA approved now for 2 types of childhood epilepsy that are very difficult to treat. And I think pretty much the indication is if you haven't responded to the traditional treatments, then the FDA has approved a trial of Epidural X. And in 2 good studies, it's shown some positive effects.
So wouldn't that show that CBD is doing something to the brain?
It's doing something, yes. It certainly can be active, but exactly how and why, how it works is not very well known. People are like, oh, CBD, how does it work? And then you ask the scientists that do that type of work, which isn't me. I'm not a neuroscientist or a pharmacologist. But if you ask them, you say, what's the mechanism of action for CBD? Still unknown.
Still unknown.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, so back to THC, which is the addictive one, its potential for addiction and how that would manifest?
Pretty much like any other substance, alcohol, cocaine, opiates, when you use THC-laden products with THC in them, and you get a positive effect, meaning you like what you feel high, a little bit euphoric, etc. It's working to some degree on the same area of the brain as those drugs in the dopaminergic system. So people like it, and when you like something, you usually want to do it again. Your body starts to adapt, you develop a habit, and so things you do frequently start to become stronger and stronger, both because of pharmacological properties, what's going on in the brain, but also just developing a behavioral habit. You like the effects, you keep doing it, and you get really used to it, and you like doing it, and you do it more, and you do it more, and you do it more. And that's how addiction works for drugs and also for some behavioral things. So it's not too surprising that it could be addictive. And there's so much research out there now in different areas of study about the nature of the addiction that can happen with cannabis or marijuana, that I always think of it as a no-brainer. Well, what about addiction? Well, we're past that. We know it's addictive for some people develop an addiction. Not everybody. Just like for alcohol, only 15% of people develop problems with alcohol, even though about 80% drink. The same with cannabis. Of those who use cannabis or have ever tried cannabis, it's under 10% that are going to develop any kind of significant problem. But of those that are currently using probably 10 to 30% have some type of addiction, mild to moderate to severe type of addiction. So some percentage are at risk for doing it.
And what does treatment look like for that?
Treatment, again, looks similar to the other types of addictions. There are certainly cognitive behavioral or behavioral motivational counseling strategies that are the things that have been best studied. They certainly help a good chunk of people that are looking to try to reduce or quit their marijuana use. They've been dabbling with trying to find medications that will help, but to date they have not found any medications that are very useful, at least in any clinical controlled trials. So usually you're trying to find different ways to cope with life, to cope with your cravings, to cope with withdrawal that you might have when you stop, learning to do other positive things and move positive things into your life so that when you're down or stressed, you have alternatives other than going to your drug, which in this case would be marijuana. So pretty similar things that people know about for treating addiction are the same things that have been studied and work for cannabis addiction.
Makes sense. Can you talk a little more about the effects on the brain, and specifically the developing brain, which would be adolescent brain?
I can, but the caveat is I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't really study that, and I'm not the most adept neuroscience kind of student. But generally, there are these studies that are fairly compelling that show that mostly they've been smoking cannabis, so the smoke might have something to do with it as well, but marijuana's impact on the brain shows up in multiple ways. You can show that, one, structurally and functionally, you can see things on neuroimaging studies that are suggesting that something bad is going on, and the different connections, different processes are all being impacted by cannabis or marijuana. Then you can test people for their cognitive function or intellectual function, their memory, etc. You can show that it's impaired under the influence of cannabis. And then you can just look epidemiologically and see that they're not functioning as well in society, either educationally, academically, etc. And you put those all together, and you know it's having some impact on the brain, which makes sense. If you're putting a drug directly into your brain, it's going to have some impact. The question is, how important is that? And what do we really know, and how do we prevent things from getting worse? And so with teens, we're very much worried about that because the teenage years and prior to and even into your young adult life, your brain is still developing. All the connections are still being formed, all the wiring is still taking shape. Same way in just the developmental process, you're learning how to engage in social situations and handle different things and cope. So if you're putting drugs into your body and your brain and affecting your behavior, it interferes not just with what's going on in your brain, but also with your development of just general good coping skills and how to manage your life. So you don't want kids to be doing drugs or alcohol or anything that's going into their brain or affecting their behavior and their ability to develop their normal processes that will protect them through their life.
Right. And can you talk about how the potency has changed over the years, over the decades, and how does that affect just
so they like to say, oh, it's not your grandmother's or your mother's marijuana that you used to smoke. So that would be me, because I'm that age now. But so like when I was in high school, the potency of marijuana that you purchased probably was somewhere around 2 to 5% THC on average. And if you got something really good, powerful stuff, it was probably up around 10%. That's probably the 1970s, 80s. Now, on average, the cannabis that people are using and it's being sold in dispensaries and commercial shops is more in the teens. So you're starting with marijuana that's 10 to 15%. So that's the stuff that back when some people were youth was the strongest marijuana you could imagine. That's just the usual stuff now. And they also sell these concentrated forms called wax or shatter that people dab and do as other processes that are up around 80 or 85% THC. And so THC is the potency that we're looking at. Now, what does that mean? Well, that certainly means you can get high or higher with much less amounts. So a higher toxicity right into your brain pretty quickly. It's probably pretty clear that people aren't smoking as much then. So you don't smoke a whole gram of 50% THC the same way you'd smoke a whole gram of 5% THC. So they do titrate their use to some degree. People aren't going to be smoking as much of the material. What's worrisome is that usually more potent products are more addicting. It's like they used to be oh, there's powder cocaine and there's crack cocaine. since crack you smoked and went directly to brain even quicker than just snorting it, then that crack experience was more intense and people would kind of more quickly perhaps develop an addiction. The same thing we're worrying about with cannabis. Do we know that that's happening? No, we don't have data that show, oh, this potency thing is really taking off this way. But everything we know about drugs in general, from studying alcohol and cocaine and heroin, that having more potent products usually leads to more problems. The one type of problem we do know that's happening is with these edible products, where you can get pretty potent edible products. And sometimes they get into the hands of children, and so they think it's candy or soda, and they take it and they get a big dose of THC into their brain and body, and they end up in the ER and have to get treated. Or even adults start off by taking a decent dose of THC, and since you take it orally, you don't feel the effect usually for about an hour, and you get impatient and say, oh, it's not working, so you take more, and then 3 hours later it all hits you. And some people have been ending up in the emergency room for that as well. So the potency issue is very important. So far, the regulatory bodies have done just about nothing to worry about regulating the products that are being sold, but that certainly should be a very quick target to hit on if and when we do a better job of regulating the cannabis products that are out there.
Right, there are so many, and I just wanted to say from a public health standpoint, we really would like people to lock up their edibles so children and animals don't get into them because of what you mentioned.
It would be just like your other medicines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You had mentioned the government regulating these substances, and isn't that also part of why we don't know as much as we'd like to about them? Why is it hard? Can you talk about some of the challenges that scientists have in studying?
Yeah. Well, since it was an illegal drug, people weren't manufacturing all the different products that are available now. So they, in a sense, have never been available to study at these high doses and these different forms of products because they've never been legal. But the real problem that still exists is that marijuana is in the Controlled Substance Act considered a Schedule I drug, which means it has no medicinal value and is only a drug that can be abused, which you can argue may or may not be true. But the problem with something's a Schedule I drug, for a scientist to get access to it and study it, you have to jump through so many hoops. You have to get a DEA license, and you have to get approval through the FDA for all kinds of things. And although that makes sense that there should be some regulation, that regulation is really, really burdensome. So very few scientists have the wherewithal and the facilities, the finances, et cetera, to set up a whole system like that and go through the stress and strain just to get a little bit of marijuana to study, particularly because the products you can get to study aren't even the products that are on the street. So we've always been able to get the product. It just takes a lot of work, and so less scientists are willing to go through that work to study it, because there's other things to study. So there's a big movement out there to try to change the scheduling of marijuana. And just about everybody agrees, scientists, people in the clinical world, the public health world, everybody thinks we should get it off of Schedule I, at least in some regard, so there's more access to it so we can study it. Like right now, all the products you can go get in a dispensary, if you have a medical approval or in states where it's recreationally approved, those products, a scientist is not allowed to go buy those products and bring it into the university and study it because it's still illegal federally to have those drugs. So if you want to get grants from the federal government to study these things, you can't just take the product off the street and bring it in. So it's a pain, a real pain, and there's a lot of people working to change it at all levels, but we haven't gotten past the DEA and FDA yet. Right.
Can you talk a little bit more about the medicinal claims of marijuana? Like, what do people really believe in it?
Yeah. Well, we'll go back again. Before we do that, when we say medicinal claims of marijuana, we're going to separate a little bit. Sometimes it's for CBD, sometimes it's for THC, and sometimes people know what they're claiming. It's what you should have, and that's usually the case. So they'll say medical marijuana is something you should try for your chronic pain. And that's the most common indication. So what's the evidence for pain? Well, there's lots of laboratory studies that show that cannabis with THC can be an analgesic. So it can provide some pain relief in a laboratory setting. Does that mean it should be used as a treatment for pain like you would use opioids? There's very little good study of that in a controlled way where you'd say for 3 months we're going to put you on a dose of THC and see how well it controls your pain compared to some opiate or ibuprofen or Advil or whatever. There's very little clinical research like that. There's lots of reasons we know that it can be a pain reliever, but we don't know how much THC you need. Does it need to be balanced with CBD? And so people usually think the more the better. But the few studies certainly that I've seen that have been pretty good, as soon as you get to a little bit higher doses of THC, the pain relief isn't there. And so if anything, with pain, what we think we know so far is it's these small doses of THC, perhaps combined with CBD, that might be the most beneficial. But nobody's even run the study to say, oh yes, now we know it should be 2 milligrams of this and 1 milligram of this 4 times a day. Nowhere close to that. But pain, we know it has some effect from laboratory studies with humans and with animals. That's just one condition. If you go to things like PTSD, which is another big one that's out there, there is basically no decent evidence from a controlled trial that cannabis of any form, whether it's CBD or CBD and THC, can be a good treatment for PTSD. But many people that have PTSD are using some form of cannabis and telling us that it helps them. But as of yet, we've been able to run no studies to tell us, yes, this can be effective and this is the dose you might try, and whether it should be, again, CBD or THC or anything like that. There are no trials where you'd look to and you'd say, if I'm a doctor, all right, I'm going to tell them, yeah, you should go get this type of cannabis product and try it 3 times a day or only at night, etc. We know it probably can help with your dreams, and that's probably all we know because cannabis tends to suppress your dreaming. So with PTSD, they've seen that it can help with nightmares. The interesting thing, this is just an aside, is that I studied cannabis withdrawal for a long time. And so if regular cannabis users that smoke and use a lot of cannabis, you get them to stop cold turkey, one of the main findings that they almost all report is strange and weird dreams. And we still don't know whether it's because for all those years they've been smoking, they just don't dream. And so all of a sudden when they stop, they start dreaming, and most dreams are strange and weird. And so all of a sudden they're having really weird, strange dreams. And so if you think about it, if you're going to give people cannabis, it should help with nightmares because hopefully it suppresses dreams. Is that a good reason to use it? There are other medications to use that we know might be helpful. So that's just 2 examples, but pretty much it's the same for all those. That's probably where there's the most research going on, and probably those 2 conditions. But all the other conditions, other than the ones where it's already approved for, like we talked about epilepsy for children, THC has been approved for stimulating your appetite for people on chemotherapy. We have THC pills that have been available for many years by prescription. But any of the 50 conditions that are approved across the states, for most of them, there's no good clinical data. There's potential based on what we know about where the receptors are in the brain that cannabis hits, but in terms of running a study where we show that it actually works, there's just really very, very little there.
And what about marijuana's effect on driving and how it impairs driving?
That's another. They're all controversial, aren't they? No matter what you say, it's like controversy, like, oh, it doesn't affect driving. The studies are pretty clear that it can impact your driving. And by that, what I mean is it can show that you're not making as quick of decisions, your judgment's slightly impaired, your reaction time might be slightly impaired. But it all depends on how much you're using. And again, the studies, like I told you, the studies don't have access to the products most people are using. So even though we have some studies where they give people some THC, the question is like, well, how high do they get them? And then see if there's impairment. But even though they don't get them very high, you still see the types of impairment that you'd say, I don't want to be on the road with that guy driving under those conditions. On the other hand, when you do a simulated driving task, you see some errors and some problems when you have people on certain doses of cannabis, but then also they seem to drive slower. And so people say, oh, well, they drive slower, so they're more careful. And so those things balance out, and it's really not a risk factor. It's a risk factor. And the epidemiological data pretty clearly show that there are more accidents with people that have indications they may have used cannabis recently. It's not perfect data.
Yeah.
You can't get perfect data. But, you know, if you just want to be honest and, you know, reasonable, you don't want people high driving.
And it is illegal, and then how do we test for it?
We don't have any good tests at this point. Some states are using saliva tests, but they do not work very well in terms of it's gone from the saliva pretty quickly, and you could still have some effects. The testing, people have been working on testing for this for so many years, some really good toxicologists, and they cannot figure this out. And that's one of the reasons I think marijuana has been delayed in terms of its legalization, is because they wanted to figure out this driving thing before they let people on the roads, but they have not figured it out. So it is still something to be worried about. What they also don't do, and this is just a little tangent again, is, you know, usually what goes along sometimes with driving under the influence, whether it's alcohol or cannabis, especially with young people, is there's other people in the car. And so when they do those driving tests and laboratory studies, they never have distractors like music playing and your friends doing stuff. And see, if you combine that with being on a drug, you're probably up for more problems. And I always ask those type of researchers, why don't you do some studies where you also have somebody else sitting beside them poking them and saying, change the channel?
Yeah,
because
that's
those are the type of things that make you prone to accidents to start. And if you add drug and that condition in a car, you know, watch out.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to these topics, it seems like there's a lot we know, but a lot we don't know.
You know, the government has told people that these products, without any guidance, are, you know, good for so many conditions. Given that it's some parts of it are an addictive drug, the THC part is addictive to start, and then telling them it's good for you, that's just not a good prevention message.
Yeah.
So if you're a prevention specialist, you know what you're fighting against. You got kind of the government fighting against you in this case by giving this message. And that's why I think these clear messages, education about the different compounds, and calling for more research before we start approving things, I think is the way to go.
Thank you. This has been Green Peak Alliance for Your Health, and we're going to show some resources here. So if you'd like to learn more about marijuana, check them out. Thanks.